Computer. Hi, and welcome to a new edition of Newsmakers. I'm Jerry Roberts. It is Tuesday, November 21st, 2 days before Thanksgiving, and happy holiday to all of those who observe. And why wouldn't you? Because you don't have to do anything but eat turkey and watch football. And I am very pleased to welcome back my old friend and colleague and one of the leading authorities on national politics that we have still standing, Mark Z. Barabak, political columnist for the Los Angeles Times. How you doing, brother?
Always an honor and a privilege to be here.
Well, it's very nice of you to take the time to come see us. So I want to talk about the presidential election and where things stand, because I, like many people in my vast global audience, am terrified of what's happening. But before we do that, I want to start by talking about a series of columns that you have done in recent months, which is what my late partner Phil Traunstein would call a perceptual scoop hiding in plain sight. And the series is called The New West. And as you write, it represents a sweeping political makeover of the West. You write about 6 states that for many years, including when you and I got into this business, were very red, what is now called red, solidly Republican, which have kind of quietly and not so quietly become pretty reliably blue, in some cases still purple, but almost without notice of what you like to think of as your big brains in the Beltway back there, political analysts. But let's talk about it. You wrote about Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, California, Oregon, and Colorado, which, more than a third of the electoral votes needed to elect the president are now solidly Democratic. How did that happen? Big picture first, and then I want to ask you a couple questions about some specific states.
Well, there's a lot of commonality across all 6 of these states. The expansion of the Latino vote, the energizing of the Latino vote, simply put, there's just a lot more Latino voters who are engaged and who even still tend to vote Democratic. We can talk about potential changes to that. The Trump factor, but even before Trump came along, the Republican Party became a much more conservative, much more socially conservative, Southern Christian party. So issues like abortion, if there's a mindset out west, and I do consider California part of the West, it's sort of a libertarian kind of stay out of my business, leave me alone. So a sense of the Republican Party moving rightward, that alienated some folks. That was sort of supercharged by Trump. The suburbs, whether you're talking about the suburbs in Colorado, places like Arapahoe County and those areas around Denver, or Maricopa County and Phoenix, those used to be Republican, and they became battlegrounds. Lately, they've become very solidly Democratic. So you have those factors, across the states. And then we can go into individuals. Bill Clinton in California, Harry Reid in Nevada, Cindy McCain in Arizona. So larger forces, and then in some instances, the work, very specific work of individuals.
Yeah. Well, let's start in California. And of course, you write about Bill Clinton, who won the state in 1992. First Democrat since Lyndon Johnson in 1964, but since then, really solidly Democratic. And we've talked a lot about, everyone has Proposition 187 and Pete Wilson and the long-lasting impact that's had on generations of Latino voters. But the other thing I thought was really interesting that you got at, that I think is less reported about, was Clinton came in, of course, there was a national recession. We were just coming out of it, but it was also the Berlin Wall had fallen, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the whole defense industry, which had supported Californians, from the very rich to those working in factories for many years, just went away. and
Yeah.
was replaced by the tech industry, by the entertainment industry. But Clinton got that. He understood that that was happening and really spoke to that. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's funny that particular piece happened to run when I was back inside the Beltway visiting my daughter who's in her early 30s and has known nothing but a Democratic California. And I had to explain to her, California once upon a time, and it's easy for us to now take it for granted. But when Clinton won in '92, it was a really big deal. As you said, the first Democrat since LBJ, and he won with less than 45% of the vote. Ross Perot was on the ballot. And there was a feeling that maybe it was kind of this fluke. And so Bill Clinton very consciously set out. In fact, the lead into that particular column it was a confidential memo at the time I got my hands on it. He hadn't even taken the oath of office, and it was a memo from his political team saying, job one has to be nailing down California. There was a lot of concern among Democrats. Like I said, it was kind of a fluky one-off. So Clinton very consciously set out to politically re-engineer California, to turn it blue. And he did it by spending an extraordinary amount of time, literally scores over his presidency, nearly 60 visits to the state, a lot of time, a lot of attention, a lot of Californians in the cabinet, a lot of policies, things like changing the rules and the laws so you could import California rice into Japan. So it was a lot of care, a lot of tending, a lot of money, a very, very conscious effort. It didn't just happen. And Democrats and Bill Clinton were right. They figured if we could nail down California, it would be key because, think about it. Every campaign now, instead of having to say, do we spend tens of millions of dollars trying to nail down California, Democrats can take it for granted. And what does that mean? That means they can compete in places like Virginia, like Georgia, like North Carolina, like those Midwestern battleground states. Places like Virginia and Georgia were just, far, far out of reach at the time. But with California nailed down now, that's a lot of money that the Democrats don't have to spend here that they can spend elsewhere.
Yeah, really a pivotal thing. Let me ask you about Arizona, because that seems to be probably the least blue.
Yep. Yes.
And of course was at the center of huge controversy in 2020, continuing to this day, when Fox News called Arizona for Joe Biden on election night, freaking out the Trump world. But what is it about the thing I liked about your Arizona piece was you showed how it's really kind of a metaphor or a case study of the whole country, because you have Democrats, more liberal, progressive people living in the cities, but you have this rural, continued, very heavily red area. What's going to happen in Arizona this time?
Boy, if I could tell you that, I could make a ton of money and buy that house up in Tahoe that I've always wanted. So I don't know what's going to happen. I as you suggest, I saved Arizona for last because it was the last to flip in the least by only 11,000 votes. Conversely, I began the series in Colorado because that had the biggest swing, an 18-point swing from when W. Bush won it in 2004 by 5 points. Biden wins by 13. That's the biggest swing of the states. So, what happened in Arizona will be familiar to those of us here in California. You mentioned Prop 187. How that antagonized and energized the Latino vote. It's something similar in Arizona with SB 10. That was there. They called it, critics called it the Show Me Your Papers law. And it was a crackdown on immigrants, illegal immigrants, if you will, folks, undocumented immigrants, if you prefer. And in some ways, it's interesting, you talk about Arizona being reflective of the country as a whole, which it is. You have, as you suggest, the blue cities, the red rural areas, and then these purple suburbs that are competitive. But it also sort of prefigured Trump, because before there was Donald Trump, there was Joe Arpaio and SB 1070 and all these laws that were aimed at people in the country illegally without documentation. That had the exact same effect that it did in California, energized a huge swath of the Latino electorate. And it's a very, very young electorate. It's folks who are just coming online, if you will, who are aging into the electorate. And I interviewed a few of them, including one who said, I grew up under Joe Arpaio. I grew up under SB 1070, started out as a Republican when he was, in high school, and then became a very ardent Democrat, and, take that and replicate it across. And I mentioned at the beginning, I think we were talking about individuals. Cindy McCain was there's someone who will tell you she really put Biden over the top. I mean, look, you win a state by 11,000 votes, you could point to an extraordinarily high turnout support among Native Americans for Biden. You could point to any number of factors, but a lot of people think Cindy McCain mattered because she was, of course, the widow of John McCain, who had a very, very antagonistic relationship with Trump. She came out and not only endorsed Biden, but did a TV ad for him. And, 11,000 votes, she probably gets some credit for a lot of those folks who I mentioned in the suburbs who kind of got a permission slip, if you will, from Cindy McCain, who said, hey, you know what, it's okay to cross over and vote Democratic. And a lot of those Republican women, a lot of the suburban voters and independents did so.
Yeah. And McCain, of course, John McCain, I think both personality wise and politically wise, had that really independent streak that you talk about is so important in the West. Yep. But gosh, I'm old enough to remember Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, and that's really where the modern kind of conservative movement began in Arizona. Yeah. And McCain was, somewhat in Goldwater's image, just in terms of his independence. So that really is the most dramatic shift, I think, of all the states you've covered.
Yeah. Well, and it's going to be competitive. When you ask for a prediction, here's one. It's going to be super competitive. I mean, I think the presidential race is going to come down to a handful, maybe a half dozen, give or take states. Arizona, I think, is sure to be one of them. Nevada is going to be another state that has, voted Democratic the last 4 presidential campaigns. But with the exception of Obama in 2008, all of those elections have been super close. I think Democrats start with that advantage, but it's going to be another super close, super competitive race, I think.
Yeah, in Nevada, you point to obviously the influence of the late Harry Reid, who was the House Majority Leader, Democratic Harry Reid, and his alliance with the Culinary Union, which is obviously huge in Las Vegas and elsewhere in the state. But that seemed to be one of the central themes that kind of united a lot of the reporting you did from the 6 states, which is organization, one of the key elements of any campaign, and really door to door, voter to voter kind of organization, and the ability of the union leaders to turn out its members not only to vote but also to work in campaigns.
Yeah, state we haven't touched on yet, Oregon. Democrats had a real scare there. In fact, one of the genesis, I don't know what the plural of genesis would be. Genocide. Okay. One of the genocide of this whole series was remembering, and you and I have been around a few years, as your listeners know. And I thought back, I remember being in Beaverton, Oregon, on the Nike campus in 2004 when George W. Bush was campaigning, and no one was like, what the hell is Bush doing in Oregon? Is he crazy? Because Oregon was competitive. I mean, Portland was one of the top, if not the top, it was one of the top 3 advertising markets in the 2004 cycle. Super competitive. Gore had just barely won it in 2000. You had Nader on the ballot. But to get back to your point, that gave Democrats a real scare. So they very consciously set out, with the help of George Soros, among others, but labor unions in Oregon, they very consciously set out to lay the groundwork and build the infrastructure they needed to win, which they did in 2004 and ever since. So very close call, energized the unions with some help from George Soros and others, and built that infrastructure. So yes, same thing in Colorado. You had the now governor, Jared Polis, was a group of billionaires, millionaires, really rich folks in Colorado who put together this, built this party infrastructure in Colorado. So a big part of it, as you suggest, is organizing and getting those voters to the polls.
And again, in Oregon, analogous to what we saw in California, the change in the economy, the overall economy, where, as you say, it was an extractive timber industry, moved to a lot of tech and sports and outdoor stuff. I think one of the numbers you cited was 3 out of 10 people used to work in the timber industry, and now it's maybe 1. So again, the blue state, red state overlay of what happens to states, and then in New Mexico, I want to talk about that just quickly. One thing I had forgotten, which is when they finally finished counting votes after 6 weeks in Florida, Bush won by 564 over Al Gore. But as you point out, New Mexico was even closer. Al Gore only won New Mexico by 366 votes.
Yeah.
Is this change in New Mexico largely, again, a demographic shift? More Latinos? Are there other issues there?
Yeah, Latinos are really, really important. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, New Mexico has more Latinos or Hispanics, as they call them there, in state offices than any other state, I think by percentage. But anyway, yeah, that's a big part of it. I talked to a Republican lawmaker who, I'm paraphrasing here, said, as long as we keep nominating, 60-year-old white millionaires, we're not speaking to the electorate. But New Mexico is interesting, and I kind of used it as a jumping off point to discuss something. It's sort of counterintuitive because when we think about the West, we think about wide open spaces and big skies and all that stuff. But the West is actually the most urbanized area in the country, meaning more people in the West live in cities than anywhere else in the country. And New Mexico is interesting because unlike most of the Sun Belt, its population hasn't grown. It hasn't exploded the way Texas has, the way Nevada or Arizona has. But what's happened is you've seen sort of a shift. You've seen the rural areas shrinking, and you've seen folks moving into the cities. The rural areas have shrunk, either people dying off or moving to the cities. And so the influence of the cities has grown at the expense of the more conservative voting rural areas of New Mexico. So that's been sort of, it's kind of a chicken egg thing, and no one really has an answer. It's like, if you're a Democrat, are you inclined to move to a city? Or if you live in a city, does it tend to make you a Democrat? No one seems to know. It's a chicken egg thing. But as someone pointed out, Republicans haven't helped themselves by becoming sort of the anti-city party, if you will.
Yeah, anti-urban. And also, again, just to touch on it briefly, these social issues, the other thing that happened with the end of the Soviet Union, and we talked about that, and the defense industry going away, but it also sort of removed from the Republican Party one of their central foundations, which was, they were the anti-communism party. They were the Cold War party. They were, for a strong military and so on, and shifted, I think, more and more to the social issues. Obviously, the evangelical voters, white evangelicals, were huge in that. But going so far to the right, I guess, I don't know, on abortion, on gun rights, on gay rights, which we're still going on, I think was a huge factor, and I think your reporting holds that up, particularly in California. But is that still salient? Is that's still going to be a big deal in 2024? And I'm asking specifically, I guess, about the Dobbs decision that knocked out Roe v. Wade. Do you think that's still going to be a central driver of the electorate next year?
I think the answer has to be yes, with the asterisk, who knows in life. But we look at the last several elections. I mean, I will speak from some somewhat humbling experience. I did the lead all, if you will, for folks. That's like the lead story in the paper when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. I think it was 3 weeks before the election, and in that story suggested that that would thrust the abortion issue front and center in 2020, which it really wasn't. And then fast forward to the Dobbs decision, and everyone was like, "Oh my goodness, this is going to be a huge issue." And I was kind of skeptical at the time, I will confess, because it's like, well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. Everyone said abortion could be overturned. It was going to be a huge issue in 2020, which it wasn't. Then all of a sudden, the Dobbs decision is overturned, becomes a huge issue in 2022, becomes a huge issue in every election we've seen this year. The difference, as people have suggested to me, is that the taking away of the constitutional right to abortion was no longer theoretical. It became real. It became actual. Big difference. And so I think we have seen no evidence or nothing that would suggest that Dobbs will not again be a really, really big driver in 2024. I would think to the detriment of Republicans, who are still trying to kind of get their arms around what's a counter. I mean, they tried it a little bit in 2022 with, Democrats are extreme. They want abortion on demand right up until birth. And then Republicans tried more recently, this 15-week cutoff. And at least in places like Kentucky and Virginia, voters weren't buying it. So yeah, I think abortion is going to be again a really, really central issue in 2024 across the board in House races, Senate races, the presidential race.
Yeah, and one indicator of it is the way that Trump has kind of finessed it, really. He takes credit for the Dobbs decision because he appointed those 3 Supreme Court justices, but he also finesses it because he'll go after Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who signed a 6-week abortion ban. Oh, no, we can't have that. So,
right.
I think he's trying to make it so Joe Biden can't really hit him so directly on it.
Yeah, if you'll indulge the understatement of perhaps the millennium, Donald Trump is not one for consistency, shall we say.
Yeah, okay. All right. So that's the good news, viewers. If you want to have a happy Thanksgiving, turn the show off right now. But now we're going to talk about that the Democrats really do have this great base in the West, thanks in large part to California. But yet we look at these national polls and even the state-by-state polls of battleground states, and Trump is now winning. It's not that he's close to Joe Biden. He's I think the NBC poll that came out this week, he was a couple points ahead. New York Times had a series of battleground state polls, and he was ahead where? Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, I think Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of that poll, but we'll get into that.
All right. So talk me off the ledge here. Why is this not the worst news? And I should be checking my Canadian citizenship application.
Well, because, okay, so to start with the most obvious thing, a poll, it's funny. And I did a column to this effect, and I invite your billions of readers around the world to look it up and to read it. They say that a poll is a, quote, snapshot in time, but I think it's more like an oil painting. And by that, I mean, there's a lot of interpretation that goes into a poll. A poll is hopefully a random sample, but there's a lot of stuff that goes into polling in terms of your modeling. Even the best poll amounts to guesswork. Who's going to turn out, in what percentage, to what degree? So we tend to, we generally tend to take them as
the royal we for pundits, those of us with pundits.
Yeah, I mean they seem very precise, right? Bush has, Trump has 49.2% and Biden has 46.3%, which sounds very precise, but most polls have a huge margin for error, which means the difference between if you could go out and talk to literally every single voter versus your sample size. So some guesswork, a lot of guesswork goes into calculating, how do you weight that? How many people are going to turn out? How many young people? How many Black people? How many old people? How many Republicans versus Democrats? So all of that is guesswork. So, this notion is a snapshot in time. It is basically a portrait or a representation of where things stand right now. It is not predictive. We could talk all day about polls that have suggested one thing and the results have been another. There are also a lot of other things that go into it. We've seen this phenomena, and it's just my hunch that we may be seeing some of this now, but when people aren't happy or feeling good about their candidate or their party, they're less inclined to respond to a poll, which may explain why these numbers are showing Biden doing very, very poorly among young people, because they're not happy right now with Biden and what's going on in the Middle East. So, if you don't like Biden or if you're pro-Trump, you're more inclined to respond to a poll or a pollster. I think that's happening. I mean, I said I was not a fan of the New York Times poll, and I suggested in my column, it was like, Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with these tablets saying, thus shall be the 2024 presidential race. With all due respect to the New York Times, it was a poll. And if you look at some of the numbers, they seem very, very screwy, like Trump winning in Clark County, which is overwhelmingly Democratic by 11 points. But it's the New York Times, and so everyone took it as the gospel truth and ran with it. My bottom line is a poll predicting a presidential race a year out is like a weather forecast predicting the weather a year out, right? We could say that on November 5th, we can surmise it will probably be cooler than it was in July and August. And depending on the location, it may rain. It may snow, but you tell me, is it going to be 76 degrees or 72 degrees or 38 degrees or 37 degrees? And those margins are what decides the presidential election. So again, I put as much value in a poll 1 year out as I do in a weather forecast 1 year out.
Yeah. All right. Well, then let's talk a little bit about the shape of the race, though.
Is there anybody left? Did we scare them off? Did they all go off to eat their turkey? I hope some people have stuck it out.
Well, not Linda. She doesn't watch anymore. But anyway, be that as it may. So here's the thing. One of the reasons, in when I'm trying to make myself less suicidal about all this, is because all of the attention right now. I mean, interestingly, Trump, who is just, sucks up all the oxygen in terms of media attention, has actually been a little bit in the background. I mean, the only thing we've heard about him is that he's gotten indicted again somewhere. I think for people, who are kind of independent, don't really follow this stuff, it's all blends into each other. Obviously for his fans, it's more evidence of the deep state going after him. But, he's not out there, or at least being magnified by the media, saying all this crazy stuff all the time. And so at this point, the election, and I think the polls reflect, it's a referendum on Joe Biden rather than a choice between Trump and Biden, which Biden really needs it to be.
Well, you make a really good point. We saw in 2016 at times that Hillary Clinton was in the news and in the forefront, she would go down in the polls. And at times that Donald Trump was in the news and at the forefront, he would go down in the polls. So, as you suggest, I think if there is an occupational hazard, if you will, for folks who do what you and I do for a living, it's assuming that everyone thinks and pays attention and attends to politics the way we do, which most people don't. The New York Times actually had a very interesting piece, I guess it was over the weekend, where they were talking to, they did a follow on to their poll. And believe me, I've been in this position. Again, I think that set of New York Times polls, they do a lot of great polling, but statistically, here's another statistic. If you do 100 polls, statistically, 5 out of those 100 are going to be completely wacky, nutty. That's just the way things work statistically. So New York Times did a follow-on to their poll, and they talked to a bunch of voters who indicated that they wouldn't vote for Joe Biden, but they might vote for Kamala Harris. And if you read the responses, it's very telling because a lot of people were like, one woman was like, well, I'm very pro-choice, and I'm going to vote for Donald Trump because all these anti-choice states have put in laws banning abortion and have it under Biden, so she assumed that was Biden's doing, right? Let's just say not the most informed voter out there. But there were others who started out saying, well, I guess I'll vote for Trump. And then over the course of the conversation, they were like, oh yeah, but he said and he did this and he did that. By the end of the conversation, they were leaning toward Biden. So this goes to what you're saying. I think a lot of folks don't attend to politics, aren't paying that close of attention. It's kind of, Trump's been indicted and he's saying all this weird stuff. People aren't engaged in the election the way you and I and those of us who follow it every day for a living are. And I'm not predicting Biden's going to win, but I do think that at a certain point, it moves away from being a referendum on Biden to a choice. And a Democratic strategist said something to me that I thought was very, very perceptive, and it stuck with me. She suggested this election is going to be one from the Democratic side. It's not going to be one driven by enthusiasm. It's going to be one driven by determination. Meaning, in her assessment, people may not be crazy about Joe Biden, but they are determined. I'm talking about Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents and anti-Trumpers. They may not be enthusiastic about Biden, but they are determined to beat Trump. Yeah.
Well, at the same time, we must, I think, stipulate that there is a certain stubbornness in the Biden campaign. Of course, we have the requisite bedwetting among Democrats, not least David Axelrod, who was Obama's chief strategist, saying, oh, it's time for Joe Biden to step aside. Because look, the one thing people know about Joe Biden is he's old and he's turned 81. And, it seems to me like and from what I've, the reporting I've read, Jonathan Martin and elsewhere, they don't want to tackle the Biden campaign, and the Biden people don't want to even, acknowledge that this is an issue. Yes, I'm old. He's old too, and he's also crazy. Now there's a winning message. Okay. But that, what are they going to do about that?
Well, there is that danger of hubris, and you could see somewhat from their perspective, right? Here's a guy who was written off, right? He was this doddering old guy talking about record players in 2020. There's no way this guy's going to be the nominee. He wins. He's locked in the basement. He's this doddering old guy. He's not going to win the White House. He does. Democrats are going to get waxed in the midterms. They're not. So you can see where this could lead. I mean, I will say, and I've written, I think Joe Biden may be one of the most, if not the most underestimated politicians of our generation. All of that said, what do they say when you do an investment with a mutual fund, right? Past performance is no guarantor of future result, right? So it's like, yeah, there is that danger that they may be a little overconfident, as hard as it is to believe. I mean, they need to acknowledge the age issue. I think they're trying to now. They're pointing out some of, Trump is only 3 years younger than Biden. They're pointing out some of his fumbles and word slips and talking about winning World War II and beating Obama and some of the goofy things he's done and said. So they're pushing back on that. But it is a sensitive issue, and there has to be someone, and maybe there is, who can have that very aged conversation with them and just lay it on the line and acknowledge this is something that they have to deal with. It's not going to go away. It is the biggest impediment. I mean, there is, as I was saying, past, prologue, all that stuff. Pick 15 years off Biden's age, and I think we're looking at 1996 all over again, which was an election when Bill Clinton was very formidable. The economy was booming. I mean, different perception of the economy now versus then. But if you take 15 years off Biden's age, I think he would be in much better shape politically than he is now, given his record and what he has to run on.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most troubling things. And you see it in almost every poll that comes out. The question gets asked different ways, but basically, who is more mentally fit to be president? And Trump beats Biden on that. I mean, that's again, yes, it has to be, they have to. Why aren't they doing anything now? You think there's really no campaign out there. You don't see a lot of surrogates for Biden. I guess maybe there's a little bit of advertising by super PACs and stuff like that. You think they're just, holding their fire? They're just, it's not the time to be out there.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I think I think there is this confidence, or call it overconfidence. They prided themselves, and by they, I mean the Biden folks, on not reacting and overreacting to every poll and every tweet or X or whatever we call them these days. I think there's a certain pride in that. And I think rightly, a lot of people don't engage and won't be engaged until probably next summer when the conventions come along. So, I think there is that sense that, it's important to lay some of the groundwork. And I know there is some consternation about whether they've sufficiently begun laying the groundwork in some of these battleground states. But I think there is something to be said. I mean, I think a lot of people right now are focused on turkey and getting ready for Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever they celebrate, and then the New Year. And again, they just don't obsess and attend politics as much as the junkies and your billions of viewers on this show do.
All right. Well, so just to go back to a point you touched on earlier, because I want to shift a little bit, but I want to sort of close out the presidential thing. It is going to come down to what, 5 or 6 states, right? We can name them. I mean, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and
Nevada,
New Hampshire, maybe second ranked there. And what, 100,000, 120,000 votes total, switch one way or the other in those states. I mean, we're sitting out here. We don't really have I mean, there's no presidential campaign in California, so we have to just watch what's going on there.
Yeah. That's basically it. It'll come down to the states you mentioned. The industrial battlegrounds that have traditionally been, the last few cycles. Maybe you throw North Carolina in there. Maybe you add a state, take a state off the map. In the course of reporting this piece, and here's I love this. Fun fact, because it's so mind-blowing. So in 1988, before Bill Clinton broke the longstanding jinx, or call it what you will. 1988, Michael Dukakis lost California, won West Virginia. What does that tell you about how things have changed?
Oh, Michael Dukakis. Now there was a candidate for the ages. Where was that? Where were we? In Atlanta? We were in Atlanta.
We were in Atlanta, and I was on the train. He did, you might recall, he did a train trip through the Central Valley the last weekend of the campaign. And after Bush hammered him throughout the campaign about liberal this, liberal that, and Dukakis was ducking and weaving and avoiding the label, chose, I don't know, was Fresno or Visalia or Turlock to say, yes, I'm a liberal.
Yeah, he was. I remember interviewing him on the way to the airport in that campaign and trying to say, hey, they're hammering the crap out of you, guy. What are you going to do about it? I don't need to address this stuff. The death penalty. And they ended up, we got out to the airport and they pushed me out of the car on the tarmac out into where the private planes are. They weren't happy about the way things had gone after our friend Larry Bush got me the interview for somehow. What about third party candidates this time? It seems like that might be,
Yeah.
Cornell West, this no labels outfit that's still kind of hanging around in the background. That could be determinative, no?
Well, we have kind of a mixed history because historically, third-party candidates tend to peter out. Ross Perot, people have done whatever people do with numbers to figure out that Bill Clinton probably would have won without Ross Perot on the ballot. He won a lot of states. He might have lost, there are a couple of states he won very, very narrowly that he might have lost. But the bottom line is Bill Clinton would have won the presidency anyway. So history shows that third-party candidates tend to peter out, don't tend to matter a lot. Then you have 2000 and Ralph Nader. And so the bottom line is, we don't know. In a close race, which this could be, and if it comes down to a relative handful of votes in just a state or two, could a Cornel West, could a Jill Stein, or a Robert Kennedy Jr. make the difference? Potentially, we don't know.
Yeah, RFK Jr. seems to pull more from Trump than from Biden, though. Well, with all the stuff.
Well, different polls show different things. We don't know, and it could be. I mean, look, voters, we love them, don't we? At the end of the day, if they get a sense that. Particularly, I'm guessing people who are really, really concerned about Trump being elected, if they see the choice coming down to Trump or the chance that a vote for a Cornel West or a Robert Kennedy would tip the election toward toward Trump, I think you may see a lot of people holding their noses and voting. In other words, if people think, I came up with my own Yogi Berra-ism going back to, you'll remember when Bill Simon ran against Gray Davis. And it ended up being way closer than anyone thought. And my Yogi Berra-ism was, the race wouldn't have been as close if it wasn't such a blowout. And by that, I mean, there were a lot of people who figured, look, Gray Davis is going to win. I don't really like the guy, so I'm going to vote for Bill Simon or another candidate. I forget, Peter Cameo was the candidate, right? So if there was a sense that it really came down to a head-to-head choice and it was super close, I think there were a lot of people who felt that they had the luxury because it was going to be a win anyway. And I think there's a lot of people who aren't crazy about Joe Biden. It goes back to my enthusiasm thing. There's a lot of people who aren't crazy about Joe Biden. So if you get a free pass, if it's like, you know what, he's going to be elected anyway, but I can sort of, make myself feel good or register my discontent by voting for a Cornel West, I'm going to do it. But I think there's a lot of people who, if the choice comes down to, gee, if I vote for Cornel West, I'm going to end up with Donald Trump. I think a lot of folks would fall back in the Biden column under those circumstances.
And we could certainly put that frame on 2016 as well, because
right. Trump was going to win, so I'm going to vote for Jill Stein. No way the guy win. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
We've seen it.
All right. Let me ask you a little bit about the Mideast situation, just the politics of it, because I don't presume to understand enough of the substance to discuss that. But one of the things in the recent polls was Biden losing support big time among younger voters. And you also have this kind of split in the Democratic Party, where younger voters who have had their minds polluted by critical theory, are very anti-Israel, or anti-Zionist, or pro-Hamas, or whatever you want to have. Is that going to be a voting issue by the time we get around to it next year?
That's a really good question. I have my doubts, only to the extent, look, if things are where they are now, with the issue front and center, with the visual and the auditory images that are coming out every day, then it could be an issue. If it fades to the background, as so many things have, I mean, what was a huge issue a year ago? I can't remember off the top of my head. So it'll be a voting issue if it's an immediate issue of concern. If it's receded to the background, then I don't think it'll be as important. I think a lot of the emotionalism surrounding the issue will fade along with it.
Yeah. And all we have to do is look at, the way, well, I think Ukraine was a big issue a year ago. And now it's like, oh, yeah, I forgot about there's a war going on, land war in Europe going on at the same time. And, the Republican Party has become, not all of it, but a lot of it, sort of a pro-Putin party in that.
I'm thinking back to what you were saying earlier in the show, when you're talking about how Republicans were the anti-communist party, which they were. I mean, what do you think old Ronald Reagan's doing in his grave right now, looking at the way Republicans have become the pro-Putin party?
Yeah. And then you look at this guy that's the House Speaker. What's his name? Johnson?
Mike Johnson, yeah.
Mike Johnson. I mean, this guy is a wingnut. I mean, he's really far out there. He's like an end of days sort of evangelical type, and he's the second in line of the presidency now. I mean, it's extraordinary what's happened in the Republican Party.
What used to be the far out extreme wing has become very much mainstream within the Republican Party.
Yeah. Okay. All right, let me switch gears. Let's talk about the Senate a little bit. First of all, the overall map in 24 is not good for Democrats, and it's been made much worse by Senator Manchin's announcement that he's not going to run again in West Virginia. So take that off the map for Democrats.
Yeah.
What do you see? I mean, you see the House flipping back to the Democrats and the Senate going to the Republicans. That seems to be the conventional wisdom of the day.
Yeah, and I would subscribe to that, with the usual caveat, who knows? But yes, I think it is more likely than not that the House will flip back. I think the dysfunctionality of the Republican Party and people like Mike Johnson, who you suggest, have given the perception, rightfully so, that the place is broken. It's not working. Republicans haven't been able to lead. The numbers in the Senate are, as you suggest, for Democrats, pretty grim. They have to win the White House, which gives Vice President, presumably Kamala Harris, the tie-breaking vote. They've got to hold on in a couple states that Trump won. Montana is a state that Trump won by, I believe, 20 plus points. Ohio, state I think Trump won by 10 or so. Very Republican-leaning states, but you do have a couple candidates there, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, John Tester in Montana, who are used to running under these sorts of conditions. Tester in particular has done a really good job separating himself from the Democratic brand, if you will. Democrats have hopes that maybe they could pick up a seat in Florida. I think that may be pretty much of a long shot, but who knows? Texas is another state. Ted Cruz, I've been doing some reporting on a follow-on to the series, talking to folks in Texas and why Texas hasn't flipped when so many of these things that we've talked about have also, suburban voters becoming Democratic, growing Latino population and such. Texas has not flipped. I've been talking to a lot of folks, and Democrats anyway are optimistic. I don't think they're deluding themselves, but they think they might have a shot at taking out Ted Cruz, who is incredibly unpopular. But that would give Democrats a cushion. But as we sit here today, Democrats have to win those two seats, the ones in Montana. I mean, they have to hang on to all the incumbents who are running, but they've got to hang on in Montana and Ohio, which could be tough. They got to win the White House, which isn't going to be a cakewalk. And then if they have any hope, if they want a little bit of a cushion, they need to either make Florida or Texas competitive, which both of which could be tough. Texas, I think, is more likely to become competitive than Florida.
Yeah, talking about Ohio and Montana per se, I mean, fewer and fewer states now vote one way for president and another way for a senator. Yeah. That used to be fairly common. I mean, it's just so tribal now.
Yes. 2016 was the first time since the direct election of senators that the vote for president lined up identically with the vote for Senate. First time since I believe it would be 1912, direct election of senators. Same thing in 2020 with one exception. Do you want to guess what it was?
Joe Manchin. He wasn't on the ballot. Who was it?
Maine. Susan Collins. Susan Collins, the Republican, won in Maine. So in the last two presidential cycles, just one state has voted differently on a partisan basis for president versus Senate. That was, up until now, unprecedented. It looks like going forth, it may be the rule.
Yeah. All right. And then what about our Senate race here in California? I will feel free to predict that there will be a Democrat elected to the late Senator Feinstein's seat. But did you go to this goofy convention over the weekend by any chance?
I did not. I stayed home and I made a delicious Japanese curry.
I think that was probably a wise choice. But the three House members who were kind of leading the things, Adam Schiff and Barbara Lee and Katie Porter, were all there, and nobody got endorsed. Barbara Lee mistakenly said she was endorsed, and then they had to call the press release back. I mean, it was kind of goofy. What do you make that out? Still Schiff, Porter?
Yeah, I think so. I think Barbara Lee really hoped to come out of that convention with some momentum, and with that endorsement, you needed 60% of the delegates, which is a pretty big reach in a race that competitive. Needed 60%. I think Barbara Lee got 42%. Adam Schiff got 41%. So it was very, very close. So did pull back that press release saying that she'd won the endorsement and put out some kind of language to the effect of she had won the most support in the competition for the endorsement, which is not quite the same thing. I'm sure they will try by day. I mean, the Barbara Lee folks will try to use that in their mailers and their advertisements in whatever fashion they can, but they did not get a clear-cut endorsement. And so whatever momentum Barbara Lee hoped to get coming out of the convention, I don't think was there.
Yeah, the way she spun that, what that reminded me of right off the bat was when you and I tied for honorable mention in the best reporting of the Peninsula Press Club for our fine coverage of the 19.
Well, one of my favorites was Joe Lieberman. I'm going to try and remember off the top of my head, but when Joe Lieberman was running for president and all these cycles blur together, it might have been, I can't remember what year, maybe 2004. He announced he finished like in 6th or 7th place in Iowa, and proudly announced that he had finished in a 4-way tie for 3rd.
And Dukakis did that too. Remember, we won the bronze in Iowa, and we won the silver in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Joe
Clinton did it too. I mean, in New Hampshire, the comeback kid.
Yeah. He did. That was
of President Paul Tsongas fell to the side.
That was quite the feat of political. Remember, that was where the comeback kid was born. And the truth is, I was there in Iowa. I was there in New Hampshire, and Clinton did look like dead man walking. And he spun a 2nd place finish in the victory. And here's another one for you. And we didn't talk about this, and you didn't ask, but I'll introduce this thought to you. So I think it's more likely than not that Trump will be the Republican nominee, but I am not 100% convinced for 2 reasons. First of all, when all the smart people are saying something's going to happen, that's when you got to step back and say, well, wait a minute. And the other thing I like doing is, I'll sometimes ask folks for a scenario, like how could something happen? And I say, give me the scenario short of alien abduction, meaning don't tell me that Martians are going to come down and whisk Trump away off into space, never to be seen again, which would make a lot of people happy. So give me a plausible non-alien abduction way. And here's the thing that I come back to, and this plays along with what we're talking about. 1984, Walter Mondale gets 49% of the vote in Iowa. Gary Hart gets 17%. So who won Iowa? Well, Gary Hart. right? How does 17 beat 49? Because he beat expectations, right? Goes on the next week to win New Hampshire, off to the race. Mondale finally wins the nomination, but not until June. I think it was settled here in California. And trivia folks will remember there was New Jersey and California voted on the same day. Gary Hart won California. If he'd won New Jersey, he might have won the nomination, but he made this crack about, well, I got to come to California and my wife is stuck back in New Jersey. Well, there won the New Jersey vote. So bring it back to the current. So what's the scenario? So let's say Trump underperforms expectation and a Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley exceeds expectations, and then builds some momentum and it goes from there. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if it does, you heard it here.
And God forbid he eats one too many Big Macs. That would really be an awful thing. All right. The series is the New West. It's Mark Z. Barabak's fascinating look at how the West was won by the Democrats, a huge shift that I really think has been underreported until now. Take a look at that. Look at Mark's column. Subscribe to his newsletter if you want to know what's really going on. And okay, he's trying to tell us not to be too suicidal over Thanksgiving. Don't worry about the polls. It'll be better when it's a choice election rather than a referendum. And anything could happen. Exogenous events await. All right, buddy. Thank you so much, and have a great Thanksgiving. Best to you, best to your family, and I guess go Niners, huh?
Yeah, same. And thanks for having me. And go Niners.